Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder how your brain holds onto information, especially when you're trying to juggle a million things at once? If you've ever struggled to remember a grocery list or a long phone number, you are not alone. Our brains have a limited capacity for what we call working memory. But there are clever tricks we use to get around these limits today. We're diving into a fascinating study that explores one of these tricks, chunking. So what is chunking? Think about your phone number. It's not just a random string of digits. It's grouped into chunks, usually 3 or 4 digits at a time. This makes it much easier to remember, right? Researchers have known about this for ages, but how chunking actually works in our brain has been a big puzzle. There are two main ideas. One is that our brain gets super efficient by compressing lots of information into a single chunk within our working memory. The other idea is that we use our long-term memory to store these chunks, kind of like a filing cabinet, and we just pull them out when we need them, freeing up our working memory. The compression idea says that when we see related items, our brain learns to treat them as one big thing inside working memory. This saves precious space. The other idea, the long-term memory retrieval accounts, suggests that we're not really storing more in working memory. Instead, we're just pointing to a bigger, more detailed memory stored elsewhere, like in our long-term memory. This is like having a shortcut to a file on your computer instead of loading the whole thing into your active workspace. These two ideas sound pretty similar behaviorally, meaning people might act the same way whether one of them is true. To figure out which one is right, the scientists in this study came up with a clever way to test them. They created a task where people learned to associate pairs of colors. The trick was that on each trial, the exact shade of the learned color would change just a little bit. This way, they could see if people were remembering the exact shade from that specific trial, which points to working memory, or if they were just relying on the average shade they learned over time, which would point to long-term memory. So, what did they find? First off, chunking definitely helped. When people knew the color pairs, their memory for those colors was much better than when the colors were just randomly presented. This is a classic chunking effect. Crucially, even though chunking helped, people were still pretty good at noticing those small trial-to-trial changes in color. This means they weren't just pulling up a generic color memory from their long-term memory. They were still holding on to some specific information from the current trial. This is a big clue that something is happening within working memory itself. But here is where it gets interesting. While people remembered the specific colors, their answers were still nudged or biased towards the average color they had learned for that pair. This nudge was even stronger when the colors were chunkable. Imagine someone asks you to recall a specific shade of blue, but you know that blue often goes with yellow in this particular context. Even if you remember the specific blue, your memory might be pulled a bit closer to a yellowish blue. This bias is key. The researchers used some fancy computer modeling to figure out which theory best explained these results. They compared different models, one for long-term memory retrieval and one for compression within working memory. The model that best explained their data was the compression model. This model suggests that chunking doesn't mean offloading to long-term memory, but rather that our brain compresses learned information directly within working memory. This compression makes the memory representation a bit fuzzy, leaning towards what is typical or expected, which is the bias they observed. So instead of pulling from a separate LTM file, the brain is actively squishing information down inside working memory, making it biased towards learned patterns. Now, a follow-up question. When does this bias happen? Does it happen when you are first learning and storing the information? Or does it happen later when you are actually trying to recall it? To test this, they did a second experiment where they sometimes gave participants a hint about which item they would be asked about after the items had been presented and were being held in memory. Think of it like an exam question where you are told ahead of time which part of the chapter to focus on. What they found was that this hint did improve overall memory accuracy. People were better at recalling the correct color when they knew which one to focus on. However, it didn't reduce the bias towards the learned average. This is a really important finding. If the bias happened only at the recall stage, then focusing attention on the specific item earlier should have helped to overcome that bias. But since the bias remained, it suggests that the learning structure, the bias, is built into the memory representation before the final recall stage. It is likely happening during the initial encoding or early holding period of the information. So, to sum up the main takeaway, chunking improves working memory not by offloading everything to long-term memory, but by compressing learned structures directly into our working memory representations. This compression makes our memory slightly biased towards what we've learned to expect, but it also allows us to fit more information into our limited working memory. It is a trade-off. better capacity at the cost of a slight, predictable distortion. The big question driving this research was how chunking, this process of grouping information, helps our limited working memory. The study's answer is that it is like a smart compression tool built right into our brain. Instead of thinking of it as retrieving information from a vast library of long-term memory, it appears our brain actively shrinks and shapes the information within working memory itself, using knowledge of regularities to make it more manageable. The way they figured this out was pretty neat. They created a specific task where the colors weren't just colors. They had subtle variations. This allowed them to directly test if people were relying on overall patterns or specific details. Then, they used sophisticated computer models to see which explanation for chunking fit the actual behavior of the participants best. And the winner was the compression model, showing that the brain actively biases memory representations towards learned averages. In the first experiment, participants spent a day learning color pairs. They were told that learning these pairs would help them later. Then, on the second day, they did the main task, remembering colors arranged in pairs or randomly. This allowed them to get a good handle on the learned associations. The second experiment built on the first. The key addition here was the use of cues during the memory holding period. These cues helped participants know which specific item they'd be asked about later. This was to pinpoint when the chunking bias was happening during learning, during holding the information, or at the moment of recall. Across both experiments, a clear pattern emerged. When items were presented as learned chunks, recall accuracy was significantly better compared to when the same items were presented without any learned association. This confirms that chunking is a powerful tool for boosting memory performance. However, this improved recall came with a twist. Participants' answers were consistently pulled towards the average color they had learned for that pair. This bias was stronger on chunkable trials, showing that the learned structure was strongly influencing their responses even when recalling specific details. The really crucial part of their findings comes from the modeling. By comparing different ways chunking could work, the researchers found that a model where information is compressed within working memory itself, leading to these gradual biases, fit the data far better than models suggesting information is simply offloaded to long-term memory. This suggests that the brain is actively using learned regularities to modify information while it is being held in working memory. The second experiment provided evidence about the timing of this bias. Even when participants were cued to focus on a specific item while it was being held in memory, the bias towards the learned color average persisted. This suggests that the biasing effect of learned structure happens early on, likely during the initial encoding or immediate maintenance of the information, rather than being a strategy applied only at the very last moment of recall. So, what does this all mean for us? It tells us that our working memory isn't just a passive container, it is an active dynamic system that uses learned patterns to become more efficient. When we group information, our brain doesn't just store it, it actively squeezes it down, making it easier to manage but also subtly nudging it towards what it expects. This is a form of intelligent, lossy compression that helps us handle complex information in a limited system. Now, as with any study, there are some limitations. The researchers point out that they explored a certain set of models. And it is possible that other, more complex models, perhaps even ones that blend compression and LTM retrieval, could also explain the data. They chose their models to be distinct, but the real brain might be a bit more of a hybrid. They also suggest future research should look at different situations. For example, how does the time we have to encode information affect whether we compress it in working memory or rely more on long-term memory? Or how do these effects play out in more real-world scenarios? Not just controlled lab tasks, understanding how these different memory strategies emerge is a key next step. One particularly exciting avenue for future research is to combine brain imaging techniques with these behavioral and modeling approaches. This could help us see exactly when in the brain and when during a trial these compresentations are formed. It could also reveal how they change over time as we hold on to information. Overall, this research offers a valuable insight into the incredible efficiency of our working memory. It shows that chunking isn't just about remembering more, but about how our brain cleverly compresses and biases information to make the most of its limited resources. It's a beautiful example of how our minds adapt and use learned patterns to navigate the world. What do you think about this idea of compressed memory? It is fascinating to consider how our brains are constantly optimizing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the human mind. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the latest psychology research. Thanks for watching, everyone.